I'm back. Sorry, annoying dog alert again there. Yeah, so it's a long-running theme within their ideological message, hatred of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, right. Message number 2. Following the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash of 1929, the Nazi Party really focused on the problems caused by that. So the Nazi Party, a lot of their propaganda material becomes centered around job creation, okay? And a lot of their message is around kind of public work schemes, building roads, the autobahns as they're known. So that becomes a central message and a very popular message within their propaganda that they're pumping out to the German people from 1929 onwards as well. Okay, number 3, they consistently put out an anti-communist message as well. Again, talked a little bit about this last week when I said that one of the things that the Nazi Party did from very early on was they sort of had this message of linking communism and Jewishness. So they kind of early on are fully anti-communist and will do anything to kind of undermine the communists. Now, I just mentioned previously that following the Wall Street crash, the Communist Party became more popular as well. That worried a lot of people in Germany, a lot of businessmen, for example. They were concerned that the communists were doing better, so the Nazi Party are able to latch on to that fear of communism and really exploit it and drive up support for themselves from businessmen and the middle classes. Lastly, I've got anti-Semitism down here, and I've got kind of question marks after anti-Semitism because this is an interesting one. And if you choose to do this for coursework, this would be an interesting area to look into. So the Nazi Party is undeniably an anti-Semitic party. No way around that. They are clearly an anti-Semitic party. Okay? But it's interesting to explore how significant that anti-Semitism is in driving their support. Because actually, if you look after 1929, after the Wall Street crash, they kind of downplay some of the anti-Semitism and elevate the arguments and their agenda on the economy. That becomes the bigger thing that they use. So if you look at a lot of election material, and this could be an interesting avenue for you to go down, election materials, propaganda, posters put out for the elections in 1932 when the Nazi Party do really well. There's not that much anti-Semitism in that message, but there's a lot on the economy. So that's an interesting argument, an area you could look into to balance out and judge and evaluate just how important that actually is. Okay, right. Other area of this argument then is looking at Hitler himself. Okay, Hitler is a huge draw, him as a character, huge draw of support for the Nazi Party. We said when Hitler went to prison that the Nazi Party kind of really struggled when he was in prison in 1924 and their support plummeted without this charismatic leader that they had. And you will be able to find tons of evidence of German people from this period talking about hearing Hitler speak. And they'll all talk about this passion and how they're almost kind of mesmerised by him. He is a skilled public speaker, or if you want to use a fancier word, he is a skilled orator. Okay? And Hitler, as a character in his speeches, is able to clearly communicate the Nazi Party messages that we've just talked through here. They are also extremely effective in their propaganda machine as well. So Hitler initially in the early 1920s, he was a big part of the construction of that. As we get to 1929 onwards, that has become a bit more associated with people like Joseph Goebbels, for example. But they're really skilled in their propaganda. Now, this last point is a really interesting one as well, which I've kind of already alluded to. But one of Hitler's other skills is that actually he's able to be very clear about who his audience is at a particular time and make sure his message is targeting that particular part of the audience. So as said before, he was able to tap into this anti-communist feeling of middle-class businessmen. So he would really pump out, if he was making a speech to business, that would be the message. It would be about, I am the candidate who will stop the communists. In contrast, if he was speaking to, say, a group of his paramilitary supporters, the SA, he might play more on there the humiliation of Versailles and the anti-Semitic message. That might be more popular there. And he's really clever and really skilled at knowing when to use which particular message. Okay. Loads of other ideas you could have for that as well. You could talk about how well he does in the presidential election. That's kind of clear evidence of his personal popularity as well, isn't it? Okay, right. Factor number 3 then is the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic themselves, so the government. Right, a couple of arguments here to look at. So, first of all, it's the whole issue of their electoral system, which is called proportional representation, which leads to unstable governments. It leads to lots of coalition governments, okay, where we've got no clear party getting majorities, so they're relying on working with other parties. And the problem in Germany is that these governments, for the most part, collapse all the time, because Germany has so many problems that they can't come to a consensus on. So if you remember last week when we talked about that chaos period, we said there were all these elections constantly because the governments kept collapsing because they couldn't solve the problems. And it's the same following the Great Depression. Once that starts, the governments that are elected, there's a government elected in 1928, just before the Wall Street crash starts, that got the nickname the Grand Coalition, because everyone felt really positive about that coalition. They thought it was going to be a strong one that would last. That crumbles, and we've got an election in 1930 because of the Great Depression. So that just feeds into this idea that democracy is a weak form of government. Okay, and again, we referred to that last week a little bit, where I said to you that the German public, this was the first time they were really trying democracy because they'd been used to strong authoritarian rule. So this kind of unstable democratic system just kind of fuels support for that idea that democracy is weak and governments will keep collapsing. Okay, right, the other factor that I've got down here as well is about some of the politicians of the Weimar era, particularly the politicians who are in government following the Wall Street crash, because you could make the argument that they are weak. So they aren't able to work together to solve problems. They let these coalitions collapse again and again and again. Okay, but also the work that you've done on, the immediate process by Hitler being offered the position of Chancellor, politicians like Hindenburg and von Papen, they gave him the position of Chancellor because they were a bit naive and they believed that they could control him. That's another weakness that they show. Hitler completely pulls the wool over their eyes, and they appoint him Chancellor, and really quickly he kind of stamps his authority over the government, as you're going to see next lesson. Okay, so weak system, weak politicians that he can exploit. Alright, so hopefully you had some of those ideas noted down. Right, final thing that I'm going to run through with you, and then I'm going to give you a little short task to do, and then this little task needs to be uploaded to Google Classroom. Okay, so what I wanted to think about was judgment and skills a little bit, I suppose. Okay, so one of the things that we've always encouraged you to do to reach a high grade in your essay writing is have a really strong judgment right from the start, where you're saying this is the most important factor or reason. And even when you are talking about other factors, trying to link it back to your judgment. Okay, that's going to create a really strong argument. So that's what I want to think about to finish today. So my judgment on this question about why does Hitler come to power in 1933, my judgment is that it's the Great Depression. That is the most important factor. It's not to say the other factors aren't important, but the Great Depression is the most important. So if I was writing this essay and I was writing about Hitler and the Nazi Party and the weaknesses of Weimar, I need to find a way to link that back to the Depression. So I've kind of given you an example of how I would do that with one of these factors. So, weakness of the Weimar Republic. My argument here would be, although proportional representation creates lots of coalition governments that collapse a lot, actually going into the Wall Street crash in 1929, there had been a few years of stability. We'd had that golden years period where the coalitions hadn't collapsed. And I just said before, in 1928, there was a coalition elected that got the nickname the Grand Coalition. That's how positive everyone thought about that government until the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. So when that happens, chaos breaks out once again in the political system. It breaks all consensus among the parties and the governments collapse again. And that's why we get so many elections. We've got an election in 1930, two in 1932, one in 1933, that Hitler and the Nazi Party can hijack. Okay? Right. What I now want you to do then, I want you to do this, but for Hitler and the Nazi Party. So I want you to think about, yes, Hitler and the Nazi Party, they're a really important reason about why they end up in power, obviously, but how can you make the argument that it's about the Depression still? How can you link what Hitler and the Nazi Party do back to the Depression? Okay, and that being the explanation for why they get into power. So I would like you to jot some ideas down on that. You can do it as simply as I've done it here if you want to, or you might want to write it up as a little paragraph. It's up to you. But I want you to submit that on Google Classroom. Okay? So how can you say that the main reason that Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in terms of what they did, how they operated, it was because of the Depression? Okay. Next lesson, we're going to moving on to look at what Hitler starts to do when in power. So you're going to be looking at consolidation of power next lesson. So we're getting into the 1930s phase from tomorrow. Okay.